Cool.
And yep, I can see my face. Let me make sure I can hear my voice. About a month ago, I had a stream, and the audio the audio wasn't going the whole time.
But the whole time, dude, that sucks. Yeah.
Voice,
That happened to me in a class,
yeah,
like video one time, except it was the video, not the audio. So I just shared the PowerPoint.
teaching over Zoom.
Yeah, I didn't want to. It was like 40 minutes, man. I didn't want to throw it all out and redo it. So I just shared the PowerPoint. Was like, look, you can follow along with my voice.
Awesome. All right, we're good to go. So, as y'all know, my name is John Vandivier. Thanks for watching. I'm here with Josh Bedi, friend of mine. We know each other through the George Mason University Econ PhD and through Caplan, which I don't know if we're going to chat about that much, but Caplan is on this year in Austin. So I'm going to be heading down there. I don't know about you. And about 6 months ago, Josh and I talked about his, I think it was a working paper at that time. I think that was also a working paper. A public choice explanation of caste, which was like super cool. And Josh is my first repeat guest on this YouTube channel. So that's kind of a fun thing. And today we are talking about Trump, about fake marriages, asylum, and gas station robberies. So if that doesn't entice you, I don't know what will. It doesn't get better than that in the world of economics. The subtitle is a connection between visa acceptance rates and visa applications. So this is also a working paper. I imagine Josh is open to criticism. I don't know. Depends on your mood. How are you feeling? What if they leave
Oh,
you a
I'm doing
comment?
well, man.
Okay.
Yeah, I like criticism. Yeah, it makes the paper better, right?
Absolutely. Love it. So the way I was thinking we do this is kind of the introductions we just did. And then if you can just walk us through the paper, and then I'll ask some questions and closing remarks. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, I'm Josh Beatty. I'm a fourth year student at George Mason. And so, yeah, this paper, it started out, I was interested in visa fraud. And the way, the reason I got interested in visa fraud is so my dad is an immigrant from India. He used to own a gas station, and a couple of my cousins own gas stations. And I have a friend who was working at one of these gas stations, and he got robbed and he got shot in the leg. And, he's fine and everything, but he was able to apply for a really unique type of visa, which is called the U visa. And so the U visa is a visa that's given to the victim of a crime, an immigrant who's a victim of a crime, and who helps the police catch the person who perpetrated the crime, right? So in this case, my friend worked with the police, and they eventually caught the guy and everything. And so that's how he got his visa, right? And that's how he eventually got his permanent residence card. And so I was really interested in that. And then later I found out there was this case in Jackson, Mississippi, where I'm from, of a police officer who was taking cash bribes from this lawyer to fake police reports, right? So that these people could apply for U visas. And so it was a big thing, right? A bunch of them got tried and found guilty. The immigrants, the lawyer, the police officer, right? And so I started digging around, and first of all, visa fraud's pretty hard to, like, data on visa fraud's pretty hard to find, right? Because it's an illegal activity, right? People aren't just reporting, yeah, I engaged in visa fraud this year, right? And so it's hard to find because of that. And I also found, as I went through my research, that visa fraud's subjective, right? Especially depending on the type of visa that we're talking about. So obviously taking cash bribes to fake police reports is a pretty obvious case of visa fraud. But something like marriage visas, where people get married, maybe part of the reason is so that the person can come over here to live in the US, but maybe they do love each other a little bit, right? And not all marriages are based on love anyway, right? I think Becker talks about the economics of marriage, and that, like, there's economic benefits to marriage, right? There's yeah, right. There are economic reasons why people get married. So whether or not we call that fraud, right? I don't. It seems a little strange, but they do have their definitions, right? And they have pretty invasive interviews to try to sniff out fraud in these marriage visas and these fiance visas, right? It's satirized a little bit in that '70s show when Fez marries Eric's sister, right? And so
I'm so glad you made that reference, by the way.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I mean that's kind of an obvious case of visa fraud, but they actually do come in and like interview them and ask them, you know, questions like that. So and some of the questions can be really invasive, right? Like how often do you have sex per week or something like this, right? Um,
That's not cool.
because yeah, and immigrants don't really enjoy the same rights. They're really privileges
Yeah.
that American citizens enjoy, right? I call them privileges because they can be taken away, obviously, in the case of immigrants. Um, but yeah, so uh, and I also found data on visa application rates, visa application rates, and now I have data on acceptance rates which I'm collecting. But at first, I didn't even need data on acceptance rates because there is a cool natural experiment where the acceptance rates of certain visas went down dramatically, and that was when Trump was elected, right? And so when Trump was elected, uh, so the fiance acceptance rate, the fiance visa acceptance rate, the K1 visa is what they call it. The acceptance rate for that in 2015, when Obama was president, was 99%, right? So if you applied for it, you pretty much got it. In 2017, Trump's first year in office, it went down to, I think, like 64, 65%,
Is that
right?
across category, or that's the U category, or
That's the K1.
K1? Okay.
That's the K1, right? And so that's a cool natural experiment, right? Trump came in, we saw a really quick, um, whether or not it's exogenous is arguable, right? But we see a quick change in the a quick discontinuity in the acceptance rates of a certain visa, and we can see if the application rates went down, and they do, right? I do find that they go down, and so it looks like people are seeing that these acceptance rates are going down, and so they're saying, all right, I'll apply for a different visa.
Yep.
But in order for them to be able to do that, they have to be eligible for a different visa, right? So I was like, okay, what other visas could they be applying for? Well, there's another type of visa called the IR visa. Okay. And so the IR visa is for immediate relatives. That's what it stands for. And an immediate relative, it could be brother, sister, husband, wife. Okay. And so in some of those instances, in the case of a husband or a wife, the only difference between an IR visa and a K1 visa for some people could be, all right, we apply for the K1 visa now while we're engaged, or we can go ahead and get married and apply for the IR visa. Okay. Exact same person. The only difference is timing. Right. And so I thought, okay, a really another cool addition to this natural experiment that I think would lend more internal validity to the study, right, and kind of tease out causality a little bit more, would be if this IR visa, we should see a rise in those application rates, right? Because presumably, if we're seeing a decrease in the K1 application rates, those immigrants, if they're still coming in, like my theory says they are, through a different visa, they have to become, there has to be some visa channel that they're coming in through, and the most obvious one would be the IR. And so we should see a simultaneous increase in IR application rates. And all these application rate numbers that I'm using are application rates as a percent of total applications, right? And so that controls for the fact that, hey, maybe we just have overall a general increase in applications, right? And that's exactly what I see, right? And it's significant, right? It's significant at like the 5% level, and the fact that it's that significant is impressive because it's like this IR is an imperfect substitute for a K1 because it doesn't just take into account the husbands and wives. That would be ideal, right? But there's also brothers and sisters who don't also or who are not also eligible for the K1, right? And so that's kind of the best evidence that I provide in the paper, right? And there's some other cool cool examples, but I don't have access to the data, right? So one is asylum and refugee visas, right? So if I can apply for asylum, and that's me that's me applying when I come in. So I come in and then I apply for asylum, or I can apply for a refugee visa, and that's me applying when I Um, that's me applying when I'm outside of the U.S., right? So exact same thing, right? The same exact person can be eligible for a refugee or asylum visa. The only difference is, where do I apply? Do I apply right now when I'm in my country, or do I go ahead and go and apply? Okay. And so another thing I kind of talk about in the paper is how manipulable a visa is. Okay. And so um, not on, and so it would be nice if I had data on asylum and refugee visas. And so I would see one go up and the other go down, right? Unfortunately, I don't have data on refugee visas. They don't release data on that for privacy purposes. I don't know why they wouldn't be able to release general data on it, because that's all I need. I might end up emailing them and try to dig a little bit deeper to get to that data. But for right now, I don't have. But I do have it on asylum visas, right? And we see an uptick in asylum visas. And so back to, how manipulatable a visa is. An asylum visa is your probability of being able to get into the U.S. on an asylum visa. You can manipulate that pretty easily, because it depends in large part on how good your lawyer is, right?
Yep.
So the more money you spend, you can raise your likelihood of being accepted on that visa, right? And that's a big part of my theory, right? You're going to apply for the visa that has the highest chance, that offers you the highest chance of getting into the U.S., right? Or wherever you're trying to get to, right? And so it's really easy to manipulate that probability with an asylum visa, because asylum visas, especially, it's not for anybody. It's only for certain types of groups. It's only for certain types of like persecution. And so if you don't argue your case correctly, you might not be in one of those protected classes or in one of those groups. And so they're just going to deny you off the bat, right? And so
I also think this goes to your point about different visas having different costs, basically different financial costs in terms of hiring the lawyer, but also just like expected value cost, likelihood of success in terms of manipulatability. When we talk about the groups that are applying for asylum and where it's likely to get granted or rejected, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of those are just a matter of identity. And so I think you could just fake it and be like, yeah, I subscribe to this religion or that religion.
Yeah. A lot of it. So there's this one article I cited, and I should have checked it out. Because it's been a while since I've read it, but there was one case where there was this woman who was LGBTQ, and she applied for it based on that, and I don't think that was a protected class, right? But she could have applied for it based on something else, and she would have gotten it, right? And so, to your point, right? And then that goes back to the subjectivity of this visa fraud, right? Like, is it visa fraud? Like, you just argued your case wrong. Does that count as visa fraud? Probably not, right?
Yeah, for sure not. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think visa fraud would be if me, and let's just say that I'm not a Muslim, but if I said that I was just to get admitted, I think that would count as fraud.
Yeah,
but
sure.
There's so many shades of gray to it, though.
But is that even a bad thing, right? Because, there's cool economic research on corruption, right? Because fraud's a form of corruption, right?
Yep.
But if you have an environment with bad institutions or with overburdensome regulations, then and fraud helps you kind of grease the wheels, then you can argue that it's efficiency enhancing, right? And I definitely think we can argue that that's the case with immigration restrictions right now, because I mean it's super regulated, right? It's funny, the same people who argue for these regulations are some of the same people who argue that socialism or communism is bad, but this is like the definition of socialism. It is super top down regulated. They try to alter the flow of certain types of immigrants. And that's another big implication of this paper. If my theory is correct, then all these attempts to kind of artificially change the composition of immigrants in the U.S. are all for naught, right? Because you're going to start clamping down on certain visa types, and you're going to get the same people applying for different visa types to an extent, right?
I was surprised a bit. Yeah, that was an interesting piece where you talked about there was previously a circular flow of Mexican immigration into the tri-state, Texas, and so forth. And they would kind of like, Mexicans would come up, work, make some money, go back home. And like I'm from Texas, and historically that was like a big thing that we all know is true. That used to be the case. And then
Yeah, it was called there was a whole program. It was called the Bracero program.
yeah, so what I didn't realize that you pointed out is that when we clamped down on the border, that actually resulted in a increase to permanent migration,
Yeah,
which
the stock. Yeah.
which was kind of surprising to me. I was like, but if you think about
Yeah.
it, it
It
makes total
decreases the
sense.
flow, but it increases the stock, right?
Yeah,
Because you can make the border crossing once, or you can try to make it multiple times. But
right.
like, let's just make it once and stay over there. We can send remittances over PayPal and not get caught. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I totally agree with you when you point out that, hey, there's fraud from a legal perspective in the United States legal code specifically, but that's quite different than what is surplus maximizing. And I think if you talk to
Yeah.
economists in general, immigration is a positive. That's like common knowledge among economists. It is a little bit more contentious to say that illegal immigration is a net gain, but I actually went that far. I don't know if you had a chance to review this
I
article.
did really quickly.
Okay.
I completely agree with you, man, but I actually don't think you go far enough, man.
Okay.
So the one big disagreement I have with you is I do think immigration restrictions are inherently immoral.
See, that's
Especially as we
interesting.
practice them, especially as, and I say we, I should say rich countries in general, because the US actually has a pretty liberal immigration policy compared to other countries. Like we can compare ourselves to Canada. Canada has a point system. Like you have to be able to speak either English or French. You have to have a certain amount of human capital in terms of education. Um, being able to be like having physical capital in terms of being able to invest in businesses like helps, and they have a point system, man. Like, so um at least we kind of put a focus on family reunification. That seems a little bit more moral. But yeah, I think just in general, as really every rich country in the world, the way they practice immigration policy is immoral inherently.
Yeah, so we're slowly turning towards your conclusions by that discussion. And so, one question that I have here, and let's just clear up, I think you already said this, but just to be clear, your paper is focused on the United States,
Hmm.
but it's still interesting to talk about it in a context of compared to what the rest of the world is doing. So, like this could be a correct or incorrect of me. I'm not sure, and you can correct me if you know. Is Canada generally easier to immigrate into?
I'd probably say it's harder. Like I said earlier, especially for low-skilled immigrants, right? So like it's always important to kind of unpack immigrants because we talk about them like they're a homogenous group, but they're
Right,
not, right?
right,
And so U.S. policy, and I talk about this in the paper a little bit. U.S. policy compared, and actually I talk about this less in this paper and more in another paper that's under review um, on immigration quotas, but the U.S. has more of a focus on family reunification. Places like Canada, they call it the Canadian system because Canada kind of popularized it. But places like Canada, your Commonwealth countries like Australia, they have a point system that focuses more on human capital and an immigrant's perceived ability to contribute economically, right? And most people think of high skilled immigrants as being able to contribute more economically. Now, I disagree with that too, because there are indirect ways that low skilled immigrants can contribute, right?
So
Um,
that's an interesting point that intersects with my work a little bit because my work is in alternative education, post
mhm,
secondary specifically, and then also my day job is as a programmer. So my
mhm,
interactions with visa are more along the lines of high skill worker visas and education visas. And it's always struck me as strange. So you just made the point that maybe low skill are more valuable. And I think it almost doesn't matter either way because in neither case would you want to cap the number of highly educated, highly skilled people. Like whether we say that low skill is less productive or more productive, the fact like in neither case do you want to cap it for high skilled,
yeah,
right?
yeah. I wouldn't
Um,
even say low skilled is more productive, but I do think it's productive, right? And
right.
I do think making it illegal makes it less productive,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, certainly, because there's less jobs that they can apply to.
That's the point Hernando de Soto makes. So he has a really good book called The Other Path. Um, the subtitle to it is An Economic Answer to Terrorism, I think, which is kind of like a sexy, title. But he works for or he worked. I don't know if he still does, but he works for an institute. He's a Peruvian economist, and he had an institute in Peru. And he like that book is about how overburdensome regulations involving business, involving property, like people's ability to own property, overburdensome regulations in Peru have led to like a huge informal economy. So the informal economy over there is like larger than the formal economy,
Yep.
and that's the case in a lot of Latin American countries. And his big thing is this informal economy is unproductive right now, but it could be productive if we just formalized it, right? We just give them access to credit institutions. We give them access to like standard rule of law, right? Like right now they have to rely on ostracism and like straight up like personal violence to be able to enforce their property rights. Like a lot of people who didn't have property rights to their land, they just didn't leave their house, right? Because if they left their house, somebody else could just take it because they didn't have a title, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So, and this does relate to the implications. I'm thinking, did we cover gas station robberies? Did we already cover that?
So that I kind of covered at the beginning, right? So
Okay.
that's what got me into this idea in general was
So which visa is that? Do you know?
that's the U visa. That's the U visa.
Okay.
And so like so there and I mentioned a couple really high profile instances in my paper of U visa fraud that's pretty unquestionably fraud, right? So there was this one in Culpeper, Virginia, close to where I'm at. I ride my motorcycle down there sometimes, and there were these two Latin American undocumented immigrants, and they staged a gas station robbery at the gas station they worked at with a fake gun. Got it on camera, and they were caught because I guess the cops realized it was a fake gun, and yeah, they literally faked a gas station robbery to be able to apply for this U visa. So my friend's my friend's story, which I mentioned at the beginning, that's a case of that wasn't fraud, right? But there are instances, right? I mentioned the fraud with the officer taking kickbacks. Staging the robbery is just another form of fraud,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
And it doesn't have
absolutely.
to be a gas station robbery, right? There's all kinds, right? If you're in a relationship with a U.S. citizen and you're the victim of like domestic violence or something, it can be something as small as that, right? It's just being the victim of a crime.
In almost any staged crime, but I think it makes for an interesting title when you call out gas station specifically.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah. So with this background, we've talked about DeSoto. We've talked about other reasons to think that immigrants are clearly valuable. My own paper, I'll put a link in the description. If we're shouting out other scholars, I can give a shout out to my dissertation chair, Brian Caplan.
Mine too.
Yeah? Awesome.
Yeah.
So he recently published Open Borders,
Hmm.
The Science and Ethics of Immigration,
Uh-huh.
which is almost like a cartoon. So it's very accessible. It's not like an academic
Yeah,
work
it's a
or anything.
graphic novel. Yeah.
Yeah. And then economics in general, we know that immigrants have a ton of value,
Yeah.
and that value would be enhanced if we just, as DeSoto says, we formalize it.
Yeah.
So the question
Another
comes.
another good recent book too. I guess so. Well, I'll go ahead and let you finish what you're saying. You might address it.
Yeah, so the question comes like, why on earth don't we formalize it if it's so obvious to anyone with like literally 101 economics education? And I think me and you, we both have a background in public choice, and I think there's the answer: is public choice.
Yeah.
There are political incentives driving this, and so this is where we kind of turn to kind of more brass tacks conclusions. What's there to do about it? Do you have any thought in that regard?
I mean, I guess education, right? I mean, it comes down to I think it comes down to a voter opinion issue. So since we're dropping work by Brian Caplan, Myth of the Rational Voter, right?
Yep.
He talked about systematic biases among voters. And one of the systematic biases he mentions is anti-foreign bias.
Yep.
And that manifests itself in anti-free trade rhetoric, and immigration is just a form of free trade. We talk about immigration like it's different from free trade. It's the same. If anything, it's more important because it's people. Like we're not talking about inanimate objects. We're talking about people who should have rights and the ability to freely contract with others, right?
Absolutely. Another question I have is we talked about the mix of visas, and by that
Hmm.
we mean like what kind of visa is it? Is it K1? Is it IR, etc.
Yeah.
Do we have any insight into the ethnic mix of visa applicants and whether
That's a
that
good
changed?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't go into it in my paper because the data is a little bit harder to find, and when you do find it, you don't have it for as many years. And I
Yeah.
needed, I wanted a little bit of time series so I could take into account differences in like broad differences in administration, right? Because there are cool natural like breaks in some of these acceptance rates based on administration. Um, but I do think for certain nationalities and ethnicities, they have more, I guess, disaggregated data. But it's hard to get anything beyond the national. It's hard to get anything lower than the national level, right? Because these are national level laws. Because we're talking about immigration, right? We have open borders within the U.S., obviously, um, and so it's hard because of that. And you know, they separate it based on region of entry. But okay, you can enter somewhere and end up somewhere completely different,
Yeah.
right? Like I think my dad came in from New York, he ended up moving to Mississippi, right? Now he's in California, and so that doesn't really tell you anything.
Yeah.
You can get like really spurious results if you rely on that as like a control, right? That's not telling you anything.
That's a good point.
Maybe you could use it. Maybe you could use it as an instrument for where they're from,
Well,
right?
that's and
Because
that's exactly the idea.
yeah,
So, I think the story is believable already, but
yeah,
I think it would be a slightly stronger result if we had the ethnic data because we're talking a little bit about Mexican immigration specifically, at least at one point in the paper. Um,
yeah, but yeah. I wouldn't even say that though, because like, okay, the guy that I knew is Nepali. And so you mentioned, well, I'll let you finish again.
I was just going to say, when we talk about border enforcement, I think what
Yeah.
comes into the popular mind is we're talking specifically about that southern border.
Hmm.
Texas accounts for a lot of that, and we're talking mainly about Latin American physical. They're like driving
Yeah.
up the roads. And so obviously there's like all kinds of immigration to America by air, sea, land, but I would kind of think the disproportionate impact would be right there. And that and if you had another point of context, go for it. But it leads into my next question, which is, um, this is related to like what can we do about it? And so are there state level solutions? Um, I don't know. Are there? So you already said that this is a national law. The visas,
Yeah.
it's a national system. Are there state level differences though? Does the state even have the ability to like override that or no?
I think previously, that's a good question. I'm not as familiar with states' abilities now. Like we have these things like sanctuary cities pop up, right? And states certainly have the ability to like local municipalities certainly have the ability to either cooperate or not cooperate with federal law enforcement, right?
In terms
but
of
like
enforcement, okay.
but like the DOH and ICE, those are federal entities, right? So if they want to, they can come in and crack down, right? Whether or not they do that, I'm sure is going to be dependent on the like how cooperative local authorities are, right? So there is some leeway, right? But I think ultimately, um, federal power trumps state, especially in this regard, right?
Yeah. So I'm still
But
just kind
also,
of
like, I want to go back to your point too on this being mostly about um, Latin American immigrants. I don't think it is, right? Because so one, um, because like so one of the things I control for is are apprehensions, right? And that's you mentioned that border enforcement, like popular, you know, in most people's mind when they think of border enforcement, they think the southern border,
yeah.
people like maybe swimming over the Rio Grande or
Yeah.
like crossing like, I mean, like not even being funny, like, or maybe crossing deserts or something like that. At least if we're thinking about it illegally, right?
Yeah.
Um, but apprehensions, I control for apprehensions and all of these regressions, and like that's just someone being apprehended for being here illegally,
So
right?
these are not
They,
just
they
border apprehensions.
yeah, they could have overstayed their visa. They could have, and that's what that's what a big number of these things are. Now, for low skilled immigrants, it usually is illegal border crossings, right? And a lot of these people will cross multiple times and get denied, and keep coming, right? Because that's how much more money they can make
Yep.
in the U.S. than in their home country, right? But like for more high skilled immigrants, or more, I guess you could say medium skilled immigrants. You know what I'm saying? More, I don't know, maybe more like bachelor level immigrants. If they're here illegally, it's because they overstayed their visa, most likely. especially if they're from somewhere like India or, somewhere where you can't just like come over here.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I had that question in my mind because the relation between border enforcement and these results. But we're not actually just talking about border enforcement. We're talking about
Yeah.
apprehensions,
Well,
which
we're
is sort
talking
of,
about border enforcement as it's defined by the DOH. But yeah, you're right that there's a difference between border enforcement as it technically is defined, which is how I define it in the paper. Um, and I try to be clear about that, but maybe I could be a little bit more clear. Um, and border enforcement is most people pictured in their mind, right? Like
yeah.
there's a big difference. We're talking generally about border enforcement, all the borders through the air, the seas, like everything, right? We're talking about increases in attempts to either keep out people who are trying to come in illegally or get people out of here who are already in here illegally.
Yeah, so I think that answers my last question, which was related, which is why do we need a visa at all?
Yeah.
Just kind of brainstorming what could be a solution that might be a little bit easier than changing federal policy, which we both know is really hard, especially after you have entrenched party interests on both sides. And so one answer a lot of times is people will say, well, let's try and handle this at the state level. With visas, though, it's national level. So one possible reconciliation is, what if I just don't need a visa? But that's where your point kind of preempts this, because you're saying that border enforcement is not just at the southern border; it's actually anywhere ICE is, which
Yeah.
is everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Okay, yeah, because I'm not super familiar with some of this, but I imagine that a foreigner could fly on a plane with a passport and get into the states.
Now here,
Um,
yeah, yeah. So that was, yeah, but it's not as easy as it is for us to go to other places. So Americans have internationally they have a privileged status when it comes to travel because it's not common for an American to like try to be an illegal immigrant somewhere else, right? Most countries don't worry about that. The
yeah,
governments of most countries don't worry about that, right? It doesn't usually happen because we have a high standard of living in the United States. The incentives just aren't there, right? And so okay, I went to Germany twice, right? Once for a study abroad and once for an internship. I got my visa stamped when I got there just with my passport. But that's because I'm an American, right? Other places, other people can't do that, right? And so that's why you need a visa. I mean, it's a function of the laws that we have in these rich countries, right? So a lot of Americans they don't realize how tough it is to get a visa because most people they can't travel with just their passport. They need the passport and the visa. For us, the visa comes almost automatically when you have the passport because most places don't care. But that's not the case for people in honestly probably most people in the world, right? Because you got places like China and India, the two most populous countries in the world, and people there like they need a visa. They can't just come here with their passport.
yeah,
They either need a visitor visa or work visa. They need some kind of visa, right?
yeah.
Whereas
This
I can go to Germany and stay there 90 days before I even like try to like apply for a visa. The visa's automatically stamped on when I come into the airport because of my American passport.
Yeah, I think the constraint does become so binding for foreigners trying to enter the U.S. And then travel visa constraints, and if you, like you can't just apply for immigration for no reason. You need to have a reason,
Yeah.
and there's a finite list of acceptable reasons, and so there are people who want to immigrate here that literally just wanting to is like not good enough, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then this does become a binding constraint where people talk about, well, just get in line. The line is really long. I don't think a lot of
Yeah.
people realize how long the line is. It's so long that a lot of people who want to get over here may not be able to get over here in their lifetime if they waited.
Yeah.
um, and so I think that's something that just needs to inform popular thought when we think about, hey, so and so came over here. Um, like, there's only a certain number of ways that they can even do that legally. And so I think on the one hand, I really want to push for reform, but on the other hand, I'm pessimistic about reform.
Yeah.
So I guess those are some of my kind of closing thoughts. And is there kind of anything else that you want to add as we just kind of close? I mean, obviously, call for reform, but I'm sort of pessimistic it's going to happen.
Yeah, I'm super pessimistic, right?
Yeah.
Because the people who I mean, so like there is a lot of push for reform um from like I guess business interest groups, which is nice. Like the Koch brothers are super open borders.
Yep.
The Koch brother now
Yeah.
is super open borders, right? Which is awesome. A lot of people don't know that, right? A lot of people give the Koch brothers a bad rep, especially more liberal-minded people. And I've had friends that will tell me they're open borders, and then they'll bash the Kochs, and I'm like, dude, the Kochs are open borders, man. Like open
Yep.
borders, pro prison reform. You know what I mean? So, I mean, there are interest groups out there, um, and even under I think the Trump administration was generally bad for immigration policy, but there were some positive. There were some very like specific positive changes that he made. So I have a section in the paper called "Quotas on Quotas" because there's a
I love that. I
quota.
love that subsection title.
Yeah,
Quotas on
because we have
quotas.
overall quotas and then we have quotas within those quotas. Like we have overall quotas on immigrants, and then we also have like you. So we used to have from each country you can't have more than a certain percent of the overall immigrants coming in from that country, right? So no more than 10% of all these immigrants can be from India, right? But that really disproportionately impacts people who are from India and China because they're the two most populous countries in the world, right? Like how many immigrants are coming from, say, Uzbekistan, right? Like that kind of it's more of a constraint for people in more populous countries. And Trump got rid of that, or at least for Indian immigrants. Now, that has to do with public choice too, right? Because he was trying to prioritize high skilled immigrants. Um, a lot of IT workers are coming out of India, right? So even then, right? It. It wasn't because immigration's good. You know, there were there were public choice concerns there too, right?
Yeah, there's a popular problem when we talk about immigration reform. So at least in the case of education, and I agree with you. I think Trump was a mixed bag, and he did some bad stuff and some good stuff. If we want to call the cup half full, some of the positive reforms that I'm familiar with have to do with alternative education.
Mm-hmm.
That and this includes Betsy Davis with all the flack that she caught. And I'm not going to speak to what she did in the public sector for K through 12, but in the post-secondary sector, she made some really good moves to liberalization of college credit and making it easier to start up a school, making it easier for you to get college credit for education that was not traditionally obtained. And this links to, once again, high-skilled workers. So expanding the definition of a highly educated worker to someone who is highly educated using unaccredited, non-traditional means. I think that's a positive move. And I think it's a move that has bipartisan support behind the scenes on the Hill. I live near DC. I think educated Republicans and educated Democrats want more educated immigrants.
Yeah.
But there's like a popular level problem where Trump will capitulate, and I'm afraid to say, hoping this doesn't turn out, but I think it will turn out, that even Biden will capitulate and say, hire Americans first. And so we're going to cap the highly educated foreigners because we want you to hire Americans first.
Yeah.
And so I don't know about you, but I kind of think maybe that's the best location where reform might happen. But even there, I don't know if the odds are great. It's kind of my
Yeah,
two
that's where it's
cents.
most likely to happen. Because I'm open borders, right? Like I don't like the fact that when people talk about freedom migration, they focus on the high skilled workers, but that's where the reform's going to start, right? I mean, it's going to be piecemeal, right? And there are some weird laws that make it more difficult to hire foreign high skilled workers. So there's like minimum wage requirements. So I think like for certain high skilled workers, they have to make a certain you have to pay them a certain amount of money, and it's generally higher than the industry average. And so obviously people are going to go with natives, right?
Yeah, that's right. And then also just the cost and time it takes to get the visa, as well as the risk of rejection, which also ticked up under Trump. He rejected more worker visas. Um,
Yeah, a lot of people that's another thing too, right? Is the rhetoric was we want the legal ones. It's just the illegal immigrants that we're going after, but the action of the Trump administration doesn't really play that out, right? Like
right.
we see a significant decrease in legal immigration under the Trump administration. And so, I mean, people have a point, right, when they say Biden and Obama are no better, right? Obama was known as the deporter in chief, but marginally they were better, right?
Yep.
Marginally they.
Yeah. Okay. What here we are, the pessimistic economists, but maybe we can end on that happy note that hopefully Biden is marginally better.
Yeah. I mean,
um,
yeah, no, I mean, it is frustrating. No, as somebody who wants more free immigration, it's super frustrating, but hopefully it's marginally. We got to think on the margin, right? So,
yeah. All right, Josh. Thanks for your time.